Hello, Berlin. How are you doing? Are you excited to be here? Well, that was kind of weak. Everybody's still sleeping. Haven't you had coffee? How are you doing? Excited to be here? There we go. There we go. All right. I just need to make this full screen so you can actually see it, huh? If I could see my cursor. All right. So I am here today to talk to you about CSS in JS. And I want to review a little bit of where we've been, where we've come, and where we're going to go next. Now, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Max Stoiber. I'm at MXSTBR almost everywhere, which looks way more complicated than it is. If you remember my name, take out all the vowels, you'll have my Twitter handle. I am from Vienna, like they said, a handsome Austrian. I work at GitHub, which you hopefully know. If you don't know what GitHub is, then what are you doing? Why are you here? I'm just kidding. And I'm most well known for creating styled components, react-boilerplate, polished, and a bunch of other open source projects in the React ecosystem. Before I dive into the state of CSS in JS, I want to talk a little bit about how CSS in JS works. Now, if you've never seen styled components, this might look a bit odd, but essentially, you write your CSS in JavaScript. Now, this is true of any CSS in JS library. I just use styled components because I made it. So clearly, it's the best. I'm just kidding. The way it works is that you write your CSS in JavaScript. And whatever library you use then goes ahead and creates a completely unique class name for your styles. In this case, we have a title component, which is a h1, right? It renders a heading. It has a color of pale violet red and a font size of 24 pixels. Now, when that is rendered into the browser, what will happen is it'll create some CSS for you with a random class name, which is based on a hash of the contents of the class. And it'll assign that class name to the DOM tag. Now, that's all well and good, but why would you write CSS in JavaScript? How does that make any sense? Aren't those two separate languages? Well, yes. However, there's many reasons to like CSS in JS. Personally, I have 5 specific ones. It gives me a lot of confidence in my code. I can add, change, and delete any CSS I want, and I know it's only going to affect the single component that it's next to. If I change the font size of my title component, nothing else will be affected, and I can be sure of that. That also leads me to completely painless maintenance, because I can delete any piece of CSS, I can delete any line of styles, and I know it's not going to happen, it's not going to change the styling of anything else. I can also completely get rid of a component, and I know that every single line of CSS that is associated with that component is deleted. I cannot have any dead CSS anymore, 0. This is also great for teamwork. In my teams, usually teams aren't made up of only CSS experts with 15 years of experience in CSS. CSS in JS makes a lot of things impossible. You can no longer have class name collisions. You can no longer have dead CSS. You can no longer have unoptimized CSS. A lot of great defaults are baked into these libraries to make your life easier. Even if you have a team with junior developers that you're mentoring that might not know CSS inside and out, you can still be sure that a certain baseline level of quality will be achieved with the code. Now, of course, if somebody writes horrible code, they're going to write horrible code, right? Whether you use CSS in JS or anything else really doesn't matter. However, CSS in JS gives you a great baseline. The 4th point, and I know a lot of people are going to be critical about this one, is fast performance out of the box. What I mean by that specifically is that CSS in JS can keep track of which components are actually used on a page. So you render a page of your app. You probably have hundreds of pages if you have a big app. And the only CSS that will be injected is the CSS of the components that are on the page, nothing else. It is automatic critical CSS out of the box. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to use any extra tooling. You don't have to rely on any detection methods. It just works out of the box because we know which pieces of styles you actually use. Now, that is doubly important for server-side rendering. When you server-side render a page, what happens is we keep track of which components you use, and we put a style tag at the top of your HTML with only the styles of the components that you actually use, which means if you use server-side rendering and CSS-in-JS, your initial HTML file will be smaller and paint in the user's browser faster than if you use a CSS file. You also save a network request, right? There's no extra network request and nothing. It's just inlined in a style tag. And the fifth one is very easy dynamic styling, right? In my React apps, I have lots of adjustments. I have extended components. I have primary buttons and secondary buttons and tertiary buttons and joining buttons and delete buttons and whatever, right? All of these adjustments are very easy to make with CSS-in-JS because I'm just extending components. I'm just working with components, and I'm extending existing ones with new styles and overriding some of their styles where I want to. We can also use a global theme. Now, whenever I say this, people come up to me, yeah, but CSS variables, right? We can use CSS variables, and they're also a global theme. They are, and they're great. I have no hate against CSS variables. I love them. I think they're a great addition to the language. However, they only allow for so much customization. With CSS-in-JS and a theme, I can swap out whatever part of the CSS I want. I can't just turn off colors. I can change the entire layout. I can build a base component library, a design system, and then I can reuse that for many different websites and style every single one differently. However, there's still the same components under the hood, which means I don't have to recreate every single little button component, modal component, navbar component. They're just styled differently, a little bit, to fit whatever you want the new website to do. All in all, CSS-in-JS guides you to the pit of success. What I mean by the pit of success is CSS-in-JS gets you in the right direction out of the bat. It's harder to write bad code with CSS-in-JS. Now, again, it's not impossible. Of course, if somebody writes horrible code, it's going to be horrible code. But CSS-in-JS guides you in the right direction and gives you a lot of things out of the box to ensure that you're less likely to mess up. Now, I like that because I always mess up, so that saves me a lot of time. A lot of people, again, when I say this, say, yeah, but we have a super great process where we do really in-depth code review and we use 15 different pieces of tooling and we can achieve the exact same thing and we don't need CSS-in-JS. And that's awesome, right? That's super great. CSS-in-JS just gives you all of that out of the box with no extra work required on your part. No extra tooling, nothing. You just use CSS-in-JS and it has sane and great defaults by default. So let's talk about where we're at. I want to talk a little bit about the present. CSS-in-JS has taken over the React world. I checked a couple of days ago, and in the last week, 60% of React installs also installed a CSS-in-JS library of some kind. 60%. That's almost the majority of React installs also have a CSS-in-JS library. That's huge. Now, that doesn't mean that CSS-in-JS is the right thing for your team, right? Maybe you have a designer that knows CSS inside out, but doesn't really know JavaScript. They have never written or typed in a JavaScript file. Then CSS-in-JS may not be for you. But if you're on a team with people who at least understand the basics of JavaScript, then it can really work. And it's worked for a lot of teams. Now let's take a look at where we came from. It all started in November of 2014. When JSS was first launched by Oleg, who I think is in the audience somewhere. JSS was way ahead of its time. At the time, nobody had even heard of CSS-in-JS. And he had built many of the same things that are in more new CSS-in-JS libraries into JSS way back in November of 2014. That's where it really all started. JSS has been maintained ever since. It's an awesome library. The real debate around CSS-in-JS kicked off when Christopher Schroeder at Vizier, who works on the React team at Facebook, gave a talk in Washington, D.C. at Nation.js. And he talked about how at Facebook, they wrote their own implementation of CSS-in-JS in order to make their styling more maintainable. And he went to this tiny conference in Washington, D.C. It's really a small conference. There's maybe 200 people there. And he went there and he gave his talk and it went well. And afterwards, his slide deck exploded on Twitter. To date, it's been seen hundreds of thousands of times. 1 million people have seen his slides because everybody was debating about it. What the hell are they doing? Why would they do this? Facebook, what are you doing? But in all actuality, it works well for them. In fact, the new Facebook.com that was announced, I don't know, half a year ago, that still hasn't launched, they built another CSS-in-JS library for internal use. And again, they're betting on it, right? They're using it for their new main website. That's huge. Then in January of 2015, Radium was launched. Radium was the first CSS-in-JS library that got really popular. They used CSS-in-JS via inline styles. So you would write your styles in JavaScript, and it would assign style tags to all of your DOM elements. Now, that approach, with the benefit of hindsight, we know is not the best one. And it isn't the best one because a lot of things you can do in CSS are very hard to do in a style tag. You cannot have pseudo-selectors, pseudo-elements, media queries. None of that works. So they tried to hack around it by, for example, pretending that hover works with JavaScript event listeners. So they would listen for mouse over and mouse out and stuff like that and assign the hover styles. But nowadays we know there are better approaches. However, Radium really was the first library to take this concept and make it more popular than it was before. Then in February of 2015, Brent Jackson, launched Rebase. Again, another great library. Now, Rebase isn't technically a CSS-in-JS library. However, it was the first library that introduced this CSS components API. So you have a box component, for example, or a flex component. And on those components, you can write your CSS as props. So you write box, and then you have font size 12 pixels or whatever. Now, since February of 2015, Rebase has come a long way. They're now in version 5. It's still very actively maintained. And in fact, we use it on all of our projects. I use it on all of my projects, I should say. Rebase is awesome, and it mixes very well with any other CSS solution you use. Then in May of 2015, we got CSS modules. Now, CSS modules is not technically a CSS-in-JS library, right? With CSS modules, you still write your CSS in a CSS file like you used to. However, I put them in this timeline because they really popularized this concept of hashing class names and giving you unique class names for your styles out of the box. So you no longer have any class name mismatches. And without them, I don't think many people would have gotten it, but they sort of provided a stepping stone and made it possible to have the same experience without having to put your CSS in JavaScript. CSS modules, again, still great, still awesome, still used by many people. I love them. They're great. Then in September of 2015, we got CS.js by Ryan Tsao. Now, CS.js is a tiny library. It's no longer maintained, but it was the first one to let you write actual CSS in JavaScript. It was the first one where you wrote your CSS code in strings in your JavaScript files. Now, CSS-in-JS eventually turned into a different library, which we'll get to. However, that was the first time anybody thought of actually writing actual CSS. Before that, everything was objects. You always wrote your CSS as a big JSON object. In October of 2015, then Khan Academy announced Aphrodite, their own CSS-in-JS solution, specifically optimized for their performance needs. It was really the first CSS-in-JS library that proved that you could have automatic critical CSS built into a CSS-in-JS library, and that the library itself made that possible. In June of 2016, Robin, who I think might also be in the audience, released Fela. Fela is a great library, again, still maintained, still being used by lots of people, still awesome. That was really the first one to focus in and hone in on this concept of style is a function of state. Just like React popularized your view is a function of state, Fela popularized your style is a function of state, which actually works super nicely with the React component model. In July of 2016, Sunil Pai, who is now on the React team at Facebook, released Glamour. And what Glamour really did, he didn't have any novel APIs. However, it really focused on performance, and it popularized a very obscure DOM API called insert rule. Insert rule is a really unknown DOM API. Before that, most CSS-in-JS libraries simply created a style tag and set its text content from JavaScript. However, that approach isn't the fastest. With insert rule, you can insert up to 100,000 rules of CSS. So a rule is like a font size 12 pixels, right? You can insert up to 100,000 rules of CSS in less than 16 milliseconds, which is ridiculously fast. When are you ever going to have 100,000 lines of CSS, right? That's insane. So Glamour really popularized that API. Now, I gotta give a shout out to Oleg again with JSS, because JSS had been using that API since November of 2014, which is incredible. Absolutely incredible. Then in October of 2016, JSX style was released by Pete Hunt, one of the ex-React team members who then founded his own startup and got bought by Twitter. Again, still a great library, they still use this, and what JSX style really did is it took this CSS components API a step further. And it went all the way. You can essentially style your entire application with a box component and put any kind of CSS into its props. Again, a great API. If that's what you like, JSX style is awesome. Rebase also awesome. Also in October of 2016, I stood on stage at React Netherlands and I announced styled components to the world. This was the first time anybody had seen this API. We really popularized this style.div API. Now, I gotta give a shout out to Fella because they actually had a very similar API long before us. However, styled components went ahead and it sort of popularized this concept of not even ever using class names. Before styled components, every CSS-in-JS library sort of returned an object of class names, and you could assign that to your DOM tags. With styled components, you're never even touching any class names anymore. They're not there. You're just creating components that are styled, and then you're using them throughout your application. And styled components was really the first library to go in that direction. Then in December of 2016, we got Styletron. That is the follow-up library to CS.js, the one that introduced strings of CSS in JavaScript. Styletron, made by Ryan Tsao at Uber. They still use it today, still great. Styletron really honed in and focused even more on performance. And what Styletron did was they created a unique class name for every single rule of CSS. Atomic CSS. If you've ever used tachyons, if you've ever used a library like that, this is exactly the same, except you don't have to worry about remembering any class names. You write your CSS like you always would, and they automatically output atomic CSS to keep your total CSS size as minimal as possible, right? At a certain point, there's only so many unique rules your CSS style sheet has, right? So the chances are pretty high that if they output atomic CSS, the total size is going to be smaller than if they injected a separate class name for every component. We also got Style.jsx in December of 2016. Style.jsx popularized this sort of easy entry with a style tag-like API. So in your JSX, you just write a style tag and put class names in there. And those class names can refer to any other element in the same component. And Style.jsx will make sure to make all of the class names unique and stuff like that, just like any other CSS-in-JS library. This is great for easy entry. It's the same as if you were to write CSS in HTML, right? Just a style tag with some styles in it. Super nice. In March of 2017, AstroTurf was announced. At the time, it was called CSS Literal Loader, but they eventually renamed it to AstroTurf. And what AstroTurf did is introduce the first-class support for CSS extraction. So with AstroTurf, you write your CSS in a JavaScript file, and they have a build process that takes that JavaScript and puts it into a CSS file. So you're no longer injecting any CSS from JavaScript, it's all extracted. You have the same authoring experience, you have the same developer experience as you would have with, for example, styled components or Glamour or any of these other CSS-in-JS libraries. However, in the end, you just get a standard class CSS file with randomized class names that you can then distribute wherever you want and load however you want. In April of 2017, Kenzie Dodds announced Glamorous, a package that is now deprecated. At the time, it was the first one to implement the styled components API, but with objects, and it really popularized writing CSS as objects again. So we went full circle. We started with CSS as objects, then we went to actual CSS, and then we went back to CSS as objects. Nowadays, almost all CSS-in-JS libraries support both, or many of them do, I would say. For example, style components nowadays also supports CSS as objects, which is why Kenzie Dodds eventually deprecated Glamorous because he didn't want to maintain it anymore. In May of 2017, I announced Styled Components v2. And the really important point about Styled Components v2 is not Styled Components. It's that we used a new CSS parser. And that CSS parser is called Stylus. Before that, everybody sort of hacked around the whole CSS parsing thing. In fact, Styled Components, the first version, it took post-CSS and it ripped out all of the node parts. And then it shipped that in the browser, which is I don't understand why we did that at the time. We had a huge bundle size. But Stylus, some guy in Africa wrote a tiny CSS parse implementation in JavaScript. It's 3 kilobytes, min.gzip, a fully featured CSS parser, and it's super duper fast. So we switched to Stylus, and nowadays almost every single CSS-in-JS library uses Stylus because it's solid, it's fast, and it's small. Stylists really made a lot of the performance gains that have been happening over the past 2 years possible. Without it, we'd probably still be having huge bundle sizes and not as fast of a performance as we have nowadays. In July of 2017, Emotion was announced. And what Emotion really did is it kicked off a performance competition. They went, oh, so we rebuilt styled components, but it's much smaller and much faster than every other CSS-in-JS library. So every other CSS-in-JS library went, crap. Now we gotta go fast too. And so everybody started working on performance. They started focusing on performance. And for that, the whole ecosystem is better off. Now all of the CSS-in-JS libraries are 10 times faster than they were 2 years ago. All of them. And they're pretty much all the same speed now. It doesn't even matter anymore, which is awesome. In September of 2017, Satya then announced Linearia, who I think is also in the audience somewhere. Lots of CSS-in-JS people here, I just realized. That's awesome. Linearia took the concept that AstroTurf introduced, extracting the CSS to a CSS file, and took it even further. It allowed you to write the styled components like API and use some of their dynamicism, and then they would still be able to extract it to a static CSS file. This is also a very popular library. It's used by many people, and it's awesome. In November of 2018, we then got Emotion v10. Emotion v10, I call that out because it really popularized using the CSS prop. So kind of similar to Rebase and JSX style, you would write your CSS on every single tag that you wrote, every single JSX tag that you wrote. However, rather than using it as props, you have one single prop, the CSS prop, and you would just write your CSS in there. In fact, they introduced it, and afterwards everybody stole it. Styled components now also have support for the CSS prop because it is a great API. And then very recently, in June of 2019, Brent Jackson, the guy who made Rebase and a bunch of other stuff, really announced Theme UI. And Theme UI really went a step further and said, okay, we now have control over your CSS. How can we make your CSS even better? And what they did was they enforced consistency by only letting you write styles that are in a global theme. So you have a defined font size scale, you have a designed spacing scale, you have color system, and you can only use values from that system, which means your entire application will always be consistently styled, which is especially important for design systems. Now, as you hear me talk about all of these things that were launched, you'll notice something. I love them all, right? I don't discriminate any of them. I made styled components now. I think styled components is the best, clearly. But to be honest with you, it really doesn't matter. All of these libraries are great. And the reason they're all great is because we all copied everything from each other. Somebody came along and had a new idea. Somebody came along and had a new invention. And they went and they built a library for it, and they announced it, and they talked about it. And then every other CSS-in-JS library went, we should also do that. And so they just copied everything from each other. And again, I have no hate. All of these people are my friends, right? I'm great friends with all of them. I love every single one of their libraries. We constantly talk with each other. And this entire ecosystem is only as good as it is because we're all working together to get better, all together. Now, where do we go from here? What's the future of CSS-in-JS? And the honest answer is, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea, which is why we need you to create the future of styling React apps. If you're working on React apps, I'm sure you've struggled with CSS before. I'm sure you've struggled with obscure bugs. If you use CSS-in-JS, I'm sure you've struggled with it too. There's always some edge cases. If you have any ideas, if you have any new things that you want to try, new APIs you think that could work, try it out. Just try building it, ship a prototype, make it work, and then share it with the world, right? Because we only got here because we all tried something new. We all put our head out there and said, I have an idea. It maybe sounds kind of stupid, but I think it could work. It feels kind of nice. What do you think? I want you to do the same thing. We're not done yet, right? We're not at the maximum. We're not perfect. We're not at the finish line, not even close. It's been 4 years, right? We have 50 years more to go, hopefully, with React. Well, at least I hope so. Now, how do you actually do this? If you have an idea, how do you go from, I have an idea for an API, to sharing it with the world and making it popular? There's 3 tips I have for you. The first one is that you have to do it in an order. You first have to make it work, then you have to make it right, and then you have to make it fast. What that means is, with style components, we had this weird idea for this weird new API that nobody's ever seen or heard, and we thought about it, and we thought, this could be kind of nice. Let's try it. And we built a super hacky prototype where we ship post CSS to the browser. And we just tried it. And then we used it to build our own personal websites. And we were like, this feels awesome. Wow. And so we launched it. We announced it. The first version, again, technically speaking, was horrible. Much worse than the newest version of style components. Much worse. However, it worked. It proved that building this API was feasible. And it made people aware that it was possible. And since then, we've then made it right. With style components v2, v3, and v4, we worked on making it right. We really focused on adding APIs so you could do anything you could do with CSS in CSS-in-JS. We focused on making the developer experience nice. We focused on having nice error messages. We focused on all of these things that in a prototype you don't really want. And then we worked on making it fast. Since version 3, we've really focused on performance. And in fact, style components has gotten faster and faster and faster with every single release. And nowadays, it's one of the fastest libraries out there. The second tip I have for you is that you should share it early and share it often. Again, the first version of style components we announced, it was a horrible hack, right? Nobody should have used it, but it proved the point and it got people talking. And we were talking to people who were like, yeah, this looks nice, but how do I make global styles happen? Yeah, this looks nice, but how do I use media queries? How do I use pseudo-selectors? How do I do multiple components? How do I extend stuff? And through these conversations, style components got better. We learned things. We knew what people wanted. We knew what was missing, and we could work on making it better. So sharing early and sharing often is super critical. In fact, if you do get around to building your dream CSS-in-JS library, ping me on Twitter, and I will share it with everyone to get you feedback. I would be super excited about that. And the third and very important point is that you really need to document all the things. A big part of why React boilerplate and styled components got popular is because they were very well documented. I spent way more time writing documentation for them than actually creating the projects themselves. Documentation is super vital to make sure that your users know how to do everything they need with your thing. For React boilerplate, that meant documenting how React works, how Redux works, how Redux Saga works, how all of these technologies that we used work. For style components, that means how do you do all the things that you do with CSS? How do you do, again, pseudo-selectors, pseudo-elements, media queries, adapting based on props, extending. All of these things need to be documented and explained and shown so that users know how to work with your library. Documentation is critically underused. You need to write a lot of documentation. I spent, again, way more time writing documentation than actually writing code. All right, I hope this was an interesting overview over the CSS-in-JS library ecosystem. Again, if you have any ideas, please build a prototype, send it to me. I'll look at it, I'll share it, I'll give you feedback. We need to get better. We're not done yet. Please keep at it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.